It began quietly, almost too quietly for a moment of such historic magnitude. Early this morning, October 17, multiple diplomatic sources confirmed what had been unthinkable for more than 3 years: Russia and Ukraine had signed a peace agreement. The document, negotiated in secrecy and finalized overnight in a neutral European capital, was announced not through a press conference or ceremony, but through a synchronized statement released by both governments. No anthems, no handshakes, no cameras. Just 12 paragraphs that ended one of the bloodiest conflicts of the century. According to initial reports, the deal was signed shortly before dawn under conditions of extreme secrecy. The talks, long rumored but never confirmed, were facilitated by a coalition of neutral states led by Turkey and Switzerland, with quiet involvement from the United Nations. Sources familiar with the negotiations describe a tense final session lasting nearly 12 hours. It wasn't triumph or defeat, one diplomat told reporters. It was exhaustion. Both sides had reached the edge. The agreement, as summarized in early briefings, establishes an immediate ceasefire along existing lines of control, supervised by international observers from the OSCE and a new special mission under the UN flag. It also includes a mutual withdrawal of heavy weapons, the exchange of all remaining prisoners of war, and the gradual reopening of transport and trade routes. A separate clause, kept confidential until the last moment, commits both nations to non-aggression and cooperative security for a period of 10 years. It is the first formal acknowledgement, from either side, that the war has reached a point of exhaustion that outweighs political pride. But even as the ink dried, the world reacted with disbelief. In Kiev, news of the deal broke just before sunrise. The government's press office confirmed the agreement but avoided the word peace, calling it instead a framework for stability. In Moscow, the official statement was similarly restrained, describing it as a pragmatic step in the interest of the Russian people. There were no celebrations, no public addresses, only a coordinated silence that felt more revealing than any speech. On the streets of both capitals, the response was muted but charged. In Kiev, people gathered in small groups outside the presidential administration, holding candles instead of flags. Some cried, some prayed, others simply stared at their phones, reading the same line over and over: "The war is over." In Moscow, reactions were more cautious. State television reported the event only in brief segments, describing it as a temporary accord to ensure regional security. Yet social media platforms flooded with quiet, almost hesitant messages: "Finally." Internationally, reactions poured in within minutes. The White House released a statement welcoming the courage to pursue peace after unimaginable suffering. In Brussels, EU leaders called it a moment that must be protected from political sabotage. In Beijing, state media hailed the agreement as a victory for diplomacy and restraint. Even the Vatican issued an official message of gratitude to those who chose humanity over pride. And yet, beneath the headlines, the questions began immediately. What concessions had been made? Who had given up what? And could any peace signed in the shadows survive the daylight? Military analysts warned that ceasefires in modern wars rarely hold without trust, and trust, they noted, was the one commodity neither side possessed. The guns may stop today, one expert told the BBC, but the silence that follows will be the most fragile sound in Europe. By mid-morning, both Kiev and Moscow were bracing for the political shockwave the deal would unleash. In Ukraine's parliament, lawmakers called for an emergency session to review the terms. In Russia, nationalist commentators demanded clarification from the Kremlin, calling the secrecy unacceptable. Even among diplomats, relief was tempered by suspicion. As one European envoy put it, "It feels like peace, but it sounds like strategy." For now, the only certainty is that, for the first time since the invasion began, the world has awakened to a day without new strikes, new offensives, or new dead. The air remains heavy, as if the war's shadow still lingers somewhere beyond the horizon. But for the first time in years, it is only a shadow, not the sound of explosions, not the echo of sirens. And yet, even in this fragile calm, one question cuts through the relief like a blade: if peace has finally arrived, what will it cost to keep it? By midday, the initial disbelief began to give way to a deeper, more complex reaction. Across Europe, governments and analysts tried to piece together the full scope of what had just happened. Details of the peace deal between Russia and Ukraine were slowly emerging, and with them came a realization that this agreement was far from symbolic, it was a complete geopolitical reset. The document, signed under the code name Project Aurora, reportedly includes over 50 classified annexes covering everything from border management to energy transit and the role of foreign peacekeepers. According to diplomatic leaks, the agreement's final version was edited until minutes before signature, with several contentious clauses sealed in handwritten form. In Kiev, the atmosphere inside the government compound was tense. Members of parliament gathered in emergency session, while the president held a closed-door briefing with his top security advisors. Early drafts of the accord, now partially leaked, suggested a phased demilitarization zone along parts of the eastern frontier, monitored by a multinational force drawn from neutral states. This alone sent shockwaves through the Ukrainian political class. "We wanted peace," one opposition figure said, "but not at the price of uncertainty." Outside, hundreds of people stood silently in the drizzle, holding photographs of relatives lost in the war. Some wept, others simply waited, as if trying to understand whether the morning's news was a victory, a defeat, or something in between. In Moscow, the tone was equally restrained, almost choreographed. The Kremlin's official briefing described the agreement as a realistic framework for long-term coexistence, carefully avoiding terms like treaty or recognition. Inside state media circles, editors received strict guidance on vocabulary: no triumph, no apology, no emotion. "This is not peace with fanfare," a senior correspondent confided off record. "It's peace written in pencil." Yet among ordinary Russians, the reaction was unmistakable. Markets rose, the ruble strengthened, and for the first time in months, the word mobilization disappeared from news tickers. In private conversations, people used another word entirely: relief. Internationally, diplomatic channels were buzzing. Ankara and Bern, which co-chaired the secret negotiations, confirmed that talks had been ongoing for months under unprecedented confidentiality. "There were no leaks because no one outside the core circle even knew it existed," said a Turkish official. The delegations met under false names, without flags or translators from either side. According to sources familiar with the process, the final breakthrough came late last night after a direct, 3-hour conversation between the two presidents, conducted not through intermediaries, but via secure line. "It was the first time in years they spoke without rhetoric," one participant said. "And for the first time, they both listened." Reactions from global powers reflected cautious optimism wrapped in strategic hesitation. Washington described the deal as a courageous first step, but warned that verification would be the true test. In Brussels, EU officials called for structured reintegration of Ukraine's economy into European frameworks, signaling readiness to support reconstruction. Beijing issued a subtle but pointed statement emphasizing respect for sovereignty and stability. Each capital, while praising the outcome, was already calculating what this new map of peace would mean for their own interests. The stock markets across Europe and Asia surged at the opening, reflecting the hope that energy routes might stabilize and sanctions could gradually ease. But investors were as nervous as they were optimistic. "It's a peace dividend with fine print," said a Swiss banker familiar with early trade movements. "Everyone's buying hope, but no one knows if it will hold past the week." Oil prices dropped sharply, only to rebound minutes later when reports surfaced of troop repositioning near the border. Even in peace, the ghosts of war refused to rest. Back in Kiev, international observers arrived in unmarked vehicles, escorted by local police. They were the first visible sign that the agreement was not just words on paper. Their task, to verify the cessation of hostilities along the entire front line. By midday, reports confirmed a rare silence: no shelling, no air raids, no alerts. For the first time since the war began, mobile sirens across the country remained silent. Children returned cautiously to schools in western regions. Farmers resumed work in fields that had lain abandoned for years. In the east, volunteers cleared rubble in the ruins of what were once towns. The war's dust was settling, but its memory was everywhere. In Moscow, government spokesmen emphasized that the deal was a pragmatic outcome of diplomacy under pressure, avoiding any hint of concession. But behind closed doors, the tone was more sober. Several high-ranking officials admitted privately that the decision to accept the terms was driven less by politics than by exhaustion, economic, military, and psychological. "We could fight another year," said one Kremlin insider, "but not another winter." As the news spread globally, images began to define the moment. A single photo leaked from the signing room: 2 pens, 2 folders, and a simple white table. No flags, no emblems, no applause. Just silence and the faint reflection of 2 shadows facing each other. "It wasn't victory," said one diplomat present in the room. "It was survival, written in ink." And as the day moved toward afternoon, one thought began to circulate quietly among diplomats and citizens alike: perhaps true peace never begins with celebration, it begins with disbelief. By early afternoon, the tremors of the morning's announcement were still spreading through both capitals, reshaping political fault lines faster than anyone could control. The ink on the peace deal between Russia and Ukraine was barely dry, yet the air already carried the weight of history. Streets once filled with sirens were now filled with questions. In Kiev, the atmosphere was fragile, suspended between relief and resentment. In Moscow, it was eerily subdued, as if the country itself didn't yet know whether to exhale or hold its breath. Inside Ukraine's parliament, tension was palpable. Lawmakers demanded full disclosure of the treaty's secret annexes, which government representatives refused to release, citing national security provisions. The president, in a rare televised address, stood in front of a plain gray backdrop and said simply, "Peace is not perfection. It is the beginning of repair." His words were careful, precise, yet the silence that followed spoke louder. Within minutes, opposition deputies accused the administration of capitulation by compromise. Outside the building, hundreds gathered, some waving Ukrainian flags, others holding handwritten signs reading, "No peace without justice." But for every critic, there were those who quietly embraced the moment. In cities across central and western Ukraine, spontaneous vigils turned into small gatherings of gratitude. Families reunited with soldiers returning from the front lines. Mothers placed candles on windowsills, whispering prayers for those who wouldn't return. One elderly woman, interviewed near Lviv, said through tears, "If it took losing everything to stop losing our children, then so be it." It was not victory. It was exhaustion, but it was peace. In Russia, the reaction was more complicated. The Kremlin's controlled messaging machine had worked overtime since morning, flooding the airwaves with reassurances about strategic stability and mutual benefit. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were visible. Prominent military commentators, long used to patriotic bombast, spoke in unusual tones of restraint. "Russia has defended its interests," one anchor said on state television, his expression unreadable. "Now we must defend our future." For the first time in years, even government loyalists avoided the word victory. Behind closed doors, however, unease grew. Sources inside the Russian government revealed that several senior generals had submitted resignation requests, citing disagreement with the terms of withdrawal. The Ministry of Defense, while publicly committed to the agreement, was reportedly uncomfortable with provisions allowing international observers in formerly occupied zones. "We built an empire of silence," one insider admitted to a European journalist, "and now we have to let the world in." That, more than any battlefield loss, seemed to sting. Meanwhile, the international community moved quickly to shape the post-war landscape. In Brussels, EU ministers announced the creation of a multi-billion-euro reconstruction fund for Ukraine, contingent on anti-corruption reforms and political transparency. In Ankara, President Erdogan held a triumphant press conference, calling the deal a victory of negotiation over blood. At the United Nations, the Security Council convened a special session to formalize a ceasefire resolution, with both Russian and Ukrainian delegates present, sitting in the same room for the first time since 2022. Observers noted the silence between them. "They didn't speak," one diplomat whispered afterward. But they didn't look away, either. The economic response was immediate. Oil prices plunged, wheat futures stabilized, and European gas markets saw their sharpest single-day drop in 3 years. Investors called it the peace dividend, though analysts warned that stability was still fragile. The ruble rallied modestly, while Kiev's currency hit its strongest level since the early months of the war. In financial circles, optimism returned faster than trust. Yet the social undercurrents told a different story. Across both countries, the war's scars were not measured in money or maps, but in silence. In border towns now patrolled by UN peacekeepers, residents stared at newly erected signs marking the demilitarized zones, unfamiliar symbols of neutrality on soil that had never known it. "It feels like the war ended in another language," said a schoolteacher from Kharkiv, watching armored vehicles repainted in white. "I can't tell if this is safety or surrender." The human dimension of the peace deal began unfolding in small, heartbreaking details. Prisoner exchanges were scheduled for the afternoon, with buses crossing into neutral territory under international escort. Families gathered near checkpoints, clutching photographs of missing relatives, unsure who would return. The first group of released captives, men with sunken eyes and trembling hands, stepped onto Ukrainian soil to the sound of muted applause. One soldier whispered to a reporter, "I didn't think I'd ever see sky again." In Moscow, where public emotion had long been muted by control, the reaction surfaced in unexpected ways. Outside a cathedral, people lit candles, for all the souls, refusing to specify nationality. Social networks filled with images of mothers on both sides posting the same message, "My son is coming home." It was a fragile chorus, tentative, uncoordinated, but unmistakably human. By late afternoon, something remarkable began to happen. Across Europe's capitals, from Warsaw to Vienna to Berlin, church bells rang simultaneously, marking the first hour of official ceasefire. The sound rippled across borders, over rivers and ruins, across fields once cratered by artillery. For those who had lived too long under the thunder of war, the sound of bells was almost unbearable in its gentleness. And yet, even as hope flickered, unease lingered. Political analysts warned that the peace, though real on paper, was still untested in the field. "Ceasefire is not peace," said one veteran observer. "It's a pause that must be earned every day." But for now, the guns were silent. The air, for the first time in years, carried only the sound of people breathing, hesitant, fragile, but free. Still, as one diplomat quietly remarked to a journalist leaving the UN chamber, the hardest war begins now, the war to keep the peace. By late afternoon, October 17th, the fragile architecture of peace was beginning to take shape. In Kiev and Moscow, the tone had shifted from disbelief to the first cautious steps of adjustment. The guns had fallen silent, the maps had stopped changing, and now the harder task began, transforming words on paper into a living reality. The ceasefire was holding, for now. No artillery fire was reported along the front line for the first 12 consecutive hours in over 1,000 days. Drones that once filled the skies were grounded under strict international monitoring. The sounds of war had been replaced by something new and unfamiliar, the whir of reconstruction trucks, the low rumble of armored transports repainted in UN white, and the faint, persistent rhythm of news broadcasts trying to explain what peace actually meant. In Kiev, the government released the first official summary of the treaty's operational clauses. It confirmed the establishment of an interim security zone, stretching across several contested regions, to be jointly supervised by peacekeeping contingents from Turkey, Kazakhstan, and Austria. The zone, once synonymous with destruction, would now serve as a demilitarized buffer, patrolled by mixed teams of foreign observers and local officials. The Ukrainian president addressed the nation again, this time more solemnly. "We have not lost," he said. "We have chosen to live." His words were met with quiet applause in the parliament chamber, restrained, uncertain, but sincere. On the streets, reactions varied sharply. Veterans and displaced families gathered in Kiev's central square, holding a massive banner that read, "Peace is not surrender." Across the city, volunteers began collecting supplies for the first convoys heading east, food, medicine, and blankets for civilians stranded in the former combat zones. In cafes, people whispered about the clauses still hidden from public view, the status of the occupied territories, the future of security guarantees, the economic terms of reconstruction. Everyone sensed that the document signed this morning was only the beginning of something far more complex. In Moscow, the official narrative hardened. State media framed the treaty as a diplomatic triumph for national stability. The evening broadcasts showed calm footage of the president in his office, signing additional decrees on economic integration and humanitarian cooperation. Absent were any images of the front, or the cost of the war. But in private circles, the mood was more subdued. Economists described the deal as an act of necessity, not strength. "We traded pride for survival," said one government advisor. It was that or economic collapse. Even within the elite, loyalty was beginning to fracture. Some saw the treaty as pragmatic statecraft, others whispered that it marked the quiet end of an era. International observers wasted no time deploying along the ceasefire line. In the gray zones that had been battlefields only days before, UN convoys rolled through shattered villages, their blue flags stark against the soot-black ruins. The sight of foreign troops walking side by side with Ukrainian and Russian officers was surreal, almost theatrical. In one small town, local children stood by the roadside holding handmade signs that read simply, "No more shooting." The simplicity of those words carried more power than any speech delivered in a marble hall. In the European capitals, diplomatic machinery whirred to life. The European Union announced an emergency session to coordinate the first wave of humanitarian assistance, while the World Bank prepared a provisional aid package for Ukraine's infrastructure recovery. Germany pledged to rebuild power stations. France offered medical teams and engineers. Even countries that had stayed neutral throughout the war, such as India and Brazil, issued statements praising a historic step toward global stability. Yet behind the optimism, diplomats traded guarded assessments. "This is a peace born of exhaustion," one ambassador in Brussels remarked. "It will hold only as long as both sides remain too tired to fight." At the same time, the military apparatuses of both nations began an uneasy transition. In Ukraine, commanders received orders to relocate certain brigades to bases hundreds of kilometers from the front. In Russia, units were instructed to enter restructuring and reassessment phases. The official term was technical, the reality was human. Soldiers who had spent years in trenches were told to pack up, return home, and learn how to exist in a world that had stopped firing. One Russian officer was overheard saying to his men, "We trained for war. No one trained us for silence." But while the battlefield quieted, the political arena was only beginning to heat up. In both Kiev and Moscow, hardliners accused their governments of betrayal. Social media, long weaponized by both states during the war, became a chaotic space of competing narratives. Some called for celebration, others for accountability. Videos of returning soldiers hugging their families competed with angry commentaries from political pundits predicting that the peace would collapse within weeks. "The ceasefire is a truce, not a trust," said one Russian commentator. "We may have stopped the shooting, but not the suspicion." Meanwhile, journalists began uncovering more details about the secret negotiations that led to this day. Leaked reports revealed that the deal's framework had been quietly shaped over months through backchannels involving diplomats, retired generals, and private mediators operating under false identities. The final breakthrough reportedly came when both presidents agreed to freeze territorial claims for 5 years under international supervision. The clause was described by one negotiator as the only formula that left both sides equally dissatisfied, and therefore equally willing to sign. As dusk settled over Kiev and Moscow, the symbolism of the day became impossible to ignore. Streetlights flickered on in cities that had spent years fearing the dark. In border towns, families crossed checkpoints carrying bags instead of rifles. In the distance, artillery barrels once aimed across the horizon were now being lowered, covered with tarps. The transition from war to peace was not clean, it was hesitant, clumsy, filled with ghosts, but it was real. In the corridors of diplomacy, a phrase began circulating among foreign observers: the silence of October. It referred to this strange, suspended moment when a continent still wrapped in the smoke of war had stopped moving, waiting to see if the calm would hold. It wasn't victory. It wasn't surrender. It was something quieter, rarer, and infinitely more fragile, the sound of two exhausted nations trying, at last, to remember how to coexist. And as the final light faded from the day, one anonymous diplomat sent a message to his colleagues that soon spread across encrypted channels: "The war ended today not because anyone won, but because no one could bear to lose again." By the morning of October 17's aftermath, the rhythm of both countries had slowed to something unfamiliar. The war that had defined a generation had gone silent, and in that silence, everything seemed to echo. Kiev awoke under pale sunlight, the sound of church bells replacing air raid sirens. Moscow, wrapped in mist, moved cautiously, as if afraid that sudden noise might break the fragile calm. There were no parades, no victory speeches, only the uneasy awareness that history had shifted overnight. Across the front lines that no longer existed, the world was beginning to breathe differently. In Kharkiv, volunteers swept debris from the streets while soldiers dismantled checkpoints. In Belgorod, markets reopened after years of tension, selling produce instead of fear. Border crossings that had been scenes of evacuation now became passageways of return. For the first time since the invasion began, trains moved freely between western Ukraine and Poland, carrying humanitarian supplies instead of refugees. "It feels strange to move without looking up," said a conductor, watching as the countryside blurred past. "We used to measure time by explosions. Now it's measured by silence." Inside government halls, the machinery of peace began to grind into motion. In Kiev, committees formed to coordinate reconstruction with international partners. In Moscow, technocrats drafted plans to redirect military funds into domestic development. Both sides issued synchronized statements reaffirming their commitment to the process, though everyone understood that process was the hardest word in diplomacy. It implied patience, compromise, and accountability, three things the war had long erased. Yet, for ordinary people, the new reality felt both surreal and sacred. In Mariupol, where ruins still marked every horizon, the first convoys of international engineers arrived under UN escort. They set up portable lights that illuminated streets untouched since 2022. Families emerged cautiously from basements, blinking in disbelief at the brightness. In one viral clip, a child pointed to the illuminated skyline and asked her mother, "Is it morning or peace?" The question captured the day's mood better than any headline. In Moscow, the government framed the end of the war as the dawn of a multipolar peace. On state television, footage showed cranes lifting concrete slabs at new housing sites and workers repainting public squares. But off-camera, the tone was quieter, even somber. The Kremlin's inner circle knew that the war's cost, economic, moral, and human, would haunt Russia for decades. "We survived," one official admitted privately, but survival is not victory. Still, for many citizens, the most profound change was the simplest one: their sons were coming home. Internationally, the world responded with cautious celebration. The UN convened an emergency summit titled The Return of Dialogue, inviting both nations to address the General Assembly together. When the Ukrainian and Russian delegations entered the chamber, the hall fell silent. No one clapped. No one stood. They simply sat, across from each other, under the same flag of neutrality. It was a moment of quiet recognition that diplomacy had done what war could not. Later, the Secretary-General summarized the feeling with restrained optimism: peace is never signed. It is practiced, one day at a time. Meanwhile, reconstruction became the new front line. European and Asian investors began preparing bids to rebuild Ukraine's infrastructure. American and Turkish companies offered technology and logistics support. The IMF and World Bank coordinated a stabilization package described as the largest humanitarian reconstruction effort since 1945. But behind the diplomacy, a different kind of anxiety persisted. Could this new equilibrium hold, or was it merely an intermission before history repeated itself? "We have a pause," said one Western analyst. "We just don't know if it's permanent." Across both nations, the media landscape began to shift. Independent journalists, once forced underground, returned cautiously to their desks. Newspapers in Kiev published editorials calling for reconciliation without forgetting. Russian columnists, writing between the lines of censorship, hinted that peace begins not when you are forgiven, but when you stop fearing the truth. The public mood was raw but introspective. People were not yet ready to celebrate, but they were ready to hope. As evening fell, thousands gathered on both sides of the border in spontaneous candlelight vigils. In Kiev's Maidan Square, a choir sang softly beneath the fading blue and yellow flags. In Moscow's Cathedral Square, bells tolled as priests prayed for the living and the lost, without dividing them. Across Europe, churches joined in unison, their bells ringing through the same hour, an echo that crossed borders without visas, without weapons. By midnight, only one image dominated global broadcasts, a wide aerial shot of the border illuminated by the glow of candles on both sides, stretching for miles. It was the first shared gesture of peace between the two nations in modern memory. No speeches accompanied it, no officials staged it. It simply happened, ordinary people standing under the same sky, holding the same small light. And as dawn approached again, the world felt suspended between relief and uncertainty. The war was over, but the reckoning had just begun. The ruins still stood, the wounds still bled, and yet something irreversible had occurred, a collective decision, born not of victory or defeat, but of exhaustion and understanding. In the silence that followed, one thought began to echo through every capital, every newsroom, every home, that perhaps peace is not the opposite of war, but the moment when both sides finally agree to stop pretending they can win. That morning, October 17, 2025, the world awoke to that fragile truth, and for the first time in years, it was enough.